Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and finance. This week, Croatia. From communism to war and now European Union membership. But is a recession-hit country ready for EU ascension? And can the EU cope itself? We hear directly from Croatia's finance minister. Also this week, Canada's drive for power. It wants to be an energy superpower. Our in-depth report takes us from the tar sands of Alberta to the Gulf of Mexico and the pipeline that could change Canada's energy fortunes. And is it really worth it to spend billions on a new stadium and infrastructure to host a World Cup or Olympic Games? From Brazil to Doha, we look at who really benefits. So we all know the European Union, and in particular the Eurozone, has been under extraordinary economic pressure for years now. And the general argument has been that the Union's, shall we say, lesser nations have played a big role in dragging down the rest. So not a great time, you would think, to add a new member. But that's what happened this week. Croatia joined the European Union after more than a decade of trying to satisfy Europe's powers that be. It was a milestone greeted with celebrations, though dampened somewhat due to the extent of the EU's current financial turmoil. Nevertheless, it marks a historic turning point for Croatia, a nation which endured 4 years of war after declaring its independence from the former Yugoslavia back in 1991. And that's part of the story. Given where it's come from and what it's been through, Croatia is probably getting the better deal here. It stands to get around $15 billion of EU financing, plus access to some lucrative EU markets and the prospect of foreign direct investment. Though critics are concerned those EU markets will actually be too competitive for Croatia. And with the EU not really in the greatest financial shape itself at the moment, foreign investment could be limited. Of course, there are opponents within the EU who are concerned with Croatia's economic weakness, as well as corruption and organised crime. But none of that could kill off the optimism on the night that Croatia became the European Union's 28th member state.
We look to Europe as a new opportunity to achieve new democratic, political, cultural and any other progress. I'm raising this glass to Europe of the future, Europe of peace and Europe of prosperity. Cheers.
Dear friends, we are here on this historic night, and that is thanks to you, Croatian people. It was your desire to join the European Union and your hard work which have made this possible. Dear friends, welcome to the European Union. Dobro došli u Europsku uniju. Thank you.
But much of this is, of course, about money. So who better to give us his thoughts than Croatia's finance minister, Slavko Linić, who's been speaking to Ivana Brikić for Counting the Cost.
To be honest, if you hadn't conducted the entire restructuring of the public sector, if you still have a high level of deficit, we can say economically that we're not fully ready to enter the European Union. However, if we have responsible people, the entrance to the European Union means a challenge. It means that we have to speed up our processes. We have to decrease the overall public debt. We need to decrease our deficits in the budget. We have to speed up our privatization processes and as soon as possible be competitive. So if the situation is not perfect, the entrance to Europe is our additional task to be more efficient and use this event in order to sort out our internal affairs.
Many analysts believe Croatia is entering the European Union with economic problems.
We always have this question about whether we can sort this out ourselves or to use Europe and its members to resolve our problems. Prime Minister Milanović was quite clear in this regard. The situation's not perfect, but we are capable of finding a remedy for ourselves. And everything that needs to be done can be done in the 2.5 years of Milanovic's mandate. In this year and a half, we've proved that we can do that, and we've been quite active. And we plan to do some additional restructuring. As you know, we are merciless, and we have much property that we can use to decrease the debt.
What can the Croatian economy offer the European markets?
We are trying to restructure our companies in order to make them competitive and have strong positions in the market. So we need to strengthen public investments because we must be energetically independent in Europe, meaning we can produce electricity by ourselves and higher amounts of derivatives and have great amounts of water and take care of the sewage system and renewable sources. All these show that Croatia can strengthen Europe in this regard, to add some new values and new products and new resources to Europe. On the other hand, to be honest, the highest value of Croatia is tourism and the possibilities of things it can offer, which includes foreign investors who would provide additional capacities and enable us to be part of Europe and provide higher revenues for us. So we have great improvement in this part.
You keep using the future tense. Do you have a bigger plan, and were you supposed to have done more by now?
Well, there are those who destroy everything. The entire public sector has not been restructured yet. The building of ships has not been restructured. The roads, Croatian waters haven't been restructured. In one part of these quite slow changes, there's a reason why the unions are against us. They don't accept restructuring. In some parts, when restructuring isn't possible, they start bankruptcy proceedings, when they have 2,500 unemployed. The opposition's against us, and it's a great disappointment for me that the Economy Union didn't accept a single offer. They didn't accept our rules for financing business operations or certain restructuring. Therefore, the government's doing it all by itself. The entire burden's on the government. Maybe that's the reason why we're so slow.
When will citizens feel they have a better life?
At a point when we decrease the unemployment rate and have higher employment. At that point, we'll be able to stabilize the income revenue in the health fund, decrease the deficits in the pension fund, and then we'll have a better life. But it still won't be perfect.
Do you believe Croatia will be successful in the European Union or create additional problems?
Well, with this government it will be successful. We won't give up, we'll continue moving on. We will try to change our society. And our messages are very clear. We have solutions, and although we're on our own, we're implementing them, which is the most important thing.
And still ahead on Counting the Cost, big sport, big money, but who benefits, really? We've got the lowdown on Olympic and World Cup spending as Brazil moves closer to both events. Right now, though, we're looking at carbon emissions and climate change, pipelines and profits. Yep, oil. Now, US President Barack Obama is expected to make a decision soon about a controversial oil pipeline from Canada. It had run from the tar sands of northern Alberta to refineries in the United States, but Obama has said building this pipeline will only serve US interests if it doesn't significantly exacerbate the problem of carbon pollution. Have a look at this now from Daniel Lack, though, who reports from Canada about those who feel the country's been pushing its oil resources much too aggressively.
200 years ago, Europeans exploring these northern lands described soil that would burn in a campfire. It's called bitumen, and these days it's the basis of Canada's drive to become an energy superpower. To those in favor of increasing use of the vast petroleum reserves here, what's being mined are oil sands, the key to Canada's economic future. But detractors prefer the term tar sands and warn that digging them out of the ground will speed up climate change and cost far more than the revenues generated. Many global oil companies are here digging, mining, and sending bitumen south to the US and world markets. Oil and gas are Canada's largest exports by far and will be, according to current projections, for decades to come.
Governments are looking to this for revenues. What's happened more recently is that the globe and the world economy has looked to Canada. Number one, they've seen the potential of the resources. I mean, the third largest resources in the world when it comes to oil.
Much of that is found in the oil sands, and that's why Canada wants U.S. President Barack Obama to approve the Keystone XL pipeline, connecting northern Alberta with the Gulf of Mexico. Awaiting the president's decision, farm fields on both sides of the U.S. border are stacked with pipes that could soon carry up to 800,000 barrels a day of extra crude. The company building Keystone says it's waited for 5 years for approval, and that is long enough.
The oil sand production is going from about 2 million barrels a day today to over 6 million barrels a day over the next 15 years. So Canada needs to find ways to get that oil to market, and frankly, markets need to find ways to get that Canadian oil to them.
Mining crude from the oil sands requires huge amounts of energy, increasing greenhouse gases even before refining or consumption. Keystone has become a symbol for environmental protesters who want comprehensive policies to reverse climate change and see President Obama's pipeline decision as a part of that.
I think you see the environmental community realize strategically by addressing pipelines they can put pressure on governments and industry and force the conversation that still is not, unfortunately, happening.
Canada is pushing the pipeline right now because Alberta oil goes to Midwest U.S. refineries, where prices are a lot lower than those on the Gulf of Mexico. Billions of dollars a year are at stake, and shipping the oil further south by rail or other means just doesn't have the same economic benefits for Canada.
What Keystone will allow is for us to essentially double our production in the next 10 years. And that's important in terms of overall revenue, not only to the jurisdiction that I live in, Alberta, but also to the entire country.
Others warn that extra revenues from oil sands development come at too high a price, the destruction of our environment and livelihoods through accelerated climate change.
We can make a lot of money expanding carbon pollution. A lot of money in this decade, a lot of money in the next decade by taking coal, oil, and natural gas out of the Earth's crust. So the question would be, if we didn't make money by helping to destroy the planet, would we have good lives?
It's a question that's asked in the Earth Sciences laboratories of the University of Calgary, where oil companies and governments fund research into the future of the energy business. Here, scientists are charting a 3-stage course for change that's aimed eventually at easing or even ending our reliance on fossil fuels.
Clean up the front end, do what we're doing better, look at clever ways of turning low-carbon fuels like coal and oil to natural gas, and then look for really clever technologies that allow the energy industry to stay in business while moving away from fossil carbon.
This is where the newest phase of Keystone begins, if President Obama agrees. After delaying a decision during last year's election campaign, he's under pressure to make up his mind soon. In the small town of Hardisty, Alberta's pipeline capital, they're counting on Keystone to be a major boost to a local economy in need of jobs and opportunity.
This pipeline is so important to our country, and I just hope these environmentalists realize that pipelines now are done so much differently. They're more concerned about the environment, and I hope they realize that we need this, our country needs this.
Under the pristine prairie, there could soon be another pipeline carrying crude oil to the world. Depending on who you listen to, it'll either be a huge economic boost for Canada or a tipping point for climate change. This is a country that has gone through big changes, from relying on farming and manufacturing in the past to petroleum and mining today. In a world increasingly concerned with the connection between fossil fuels and climate change, it's a transition that some Canadians have begun to question. For Counting the Cost, I'm Daniel Lack in Toronto.
Finally this week, a big look at big sport. We touched on it a few weeks ago when the protests in Brazil were at their height. But an issue like this one doesn't go away because it is prone to repeat itself. So you've got the drama and the sporting spectacle, the global television audience of billions. But there's also the cost of staging such events as the Olympics and the World Cup, and that eternal question over whether that cost was really worth it. Brazil, first of all, and the anger about the cost of next year's Football World Cup versus the level of investment in public services. Here's Gabriel Elizondo in Rio de Janeiro.
On this pitch inside Rio's Maracanã Stadium, Brazil crowned a champion of the Confederations Cup. And in the eyes of FIFA, Brazil as a country has now shown it's prepared to host something even bigger.
Brazil is now ready to go to the Masters, and the Masters is next year, the World Cup.
But the past 2 weeks of football have coincided with some of the most widespread civil unrest in the country's history. It's been anger over poor public services, but also aimed at FIFA itself and the money Brazil's spending to get ready for the World Cup.
A recent poll found that more than 80% of Brazilians agree with the protests, and now there's a real belief that any of these big events, whether it had been the Confederations Cup, the World Cup next year, or even the Olympics in 2016, can now be used as a stage not only for sports, but future protests as well.
Marcelo Freixo, a Rio lawmaker and anti-corruption campaigner, says the idea Brazil is ready for the World Cup now takes on new significance.
Brazil is prepared on the field, but not when it comes to public health or with education. It's not prepared in affordable housing. A lot of people don't have a home. Brazil may be prepared for the World Cup, but it's not included the fundamental rights for people who live here.
After initially ignoring the protests, FIFA is now saying they took note of the social unrest.
It's not to close our eyes and to say that nothing has happened. Something has happened in Brazil, clearly, and we have seen and listened to what has happened in Brazil. We, FIFA, are organizing a competition. We are not, by the way, just between the lines, interested by stadiums. We are interested by the legacy.
Brazil, the country of football, is now radically different, with millions now saying they love the game, but also calling for something more substantial off the field.
So that's Brazil, but skip ahead 2 events and we'll actually be here for Qatar 2022. Now, it's a different scenario here when it comes to the event's legacy because, as you'll now see, Qatar is in many ways having to start from scratch. So we're here on what is effectively Doha's northern city limits. It's a hot summer's day already, pushing 40 degrees at about 8 in the morning. Now, if you look back over that way, you've got the central business district. And this area here is, well, at this point, it's just a dust bowl, isn't it? But if all goes according to plan, this will be what people talk about when they talk about the 2022 World Cup and its legacy. For starters, this is where the main stadium will be. They're building an 80,000-seat venue called the Lusail Iconic Stadium. It'll be, as these venues tend to be, the centerpiece of the whole World Cup. It's actually a brand new city because that's what will be built around the iconic stadium, something called Lusail City. It's this whole area out here. We're talking 35 square kilometers, and they say by the end of it all, 200,000 inhabitants, 170,000 employees, 22 hotels, 4 man-made islands thrown in as well. Now, if you're talking legacy, then a brand new city built from scratch for a growing country is a pretty good one. But the question that always has to be asked in this part of the world is the one about supply and demand. Quite simply, will there be enough demand to fill all this supply? Now, there's already a lot of empty real estate across Doha these days, and there's a lot of big infrastructure projects which are still to come online or are maybe just in their infancy. Now, yes, the population is growing, but it's still only around 2 million, and a large proportion of that is the migrant labour and expat population who are actually building places like this. Now, they're not the population who'll be filling a Lusail city of the future. The big advantage that Qatar will have with this tournament is that so much of the infrastructure which you need for a tournament like this doesn't even exist. They're starting with a clean slate. This road, for example, brand new but temporary, whilst we wait for the Lusail Expressway, a 3-level expressway to be built. And just on our left over here is where a train station will be for a brand new underground metro line which will run across the city of Doha, an entirely new train network for a country and a city that doesn't really have public transport at the moment. So yes, everything's being built for the 2022 World Cup, but you could also argue that the World Cup is just a stimulus, the thing which was being used to kickstart this country's growth. So, major sporting events, benefit or burden? Let's look at a few examples. Go back to 1976, Montreal ran up a debt of $2.8 billion from the Olympic Games, which took, in those days, 3 decades to pay off. Athens projected the 2004 Games would cost $16 billion, but ended up costing 10 times as much, with Greek debt spiralling post-2004. And the total cost of the Beijing Games in 2008 was a staggering $40 billion. However, broader investment in infrastructure linked to the event is considered to have benefited China. And while South Africa spent just $4 billion hosting the 2010 Football World Cup, it's reported to have left the hosts billions of dollars in debt. Well, Stefan Zemansky is an expert in sports economics, and he's joining us via Skype from Michigan in the United States. And we thank you for your time, Stefan. Our central question in this segment is it worth it? Now, I know there are so many variables to think about, but for the amount a country can spend in hosting a big sports event, is it really worth it for what you get back?
Well, I think it's a bit like thinking about your family and thinking about whether it's worth going on that holiday or worth going to the theatre or the cinema. And really, it's one of those subjective things. It's worth it if you enjoy it. And the key point here is to focus on that this is about consumption. It's not about investment and getting rich. You don't have these entertainments because you're going to make money. You have these entertainments because you enjoy them.
OK, then let's be specific. Let's talk about Brazil, given the protests have been there during the Confederations Cup. And, of course, they're thinking ahead to the World Cup and the Olympic Games. It's a lot of outlay for a country which does have socioeconomic issues to deal with, things like poverty and the like.
Well, I think that's right, but I also think you have to realize that there's something symbolic about this. It's really about the Brazilian government, in the eyes of the protesters, wasting their time dealing with bread and circuses, if you will, rather than focusing on the real issues, which are dealing with poverty and development, education, health, and so on. The point is that viewed from an economic point of view, whether this is a good way to spend money or a bad way to spend money, actually it's a drop in the ocean. Relative to the size of the Brazilian economy, this is less than 0.1% of the nation's annual income.
Can you think of a country which, in hindsight, has gotten the balance right? You know, it spent a good amount of money, it put on a good show, but then it actually got something out of it long term, you know, the L word, legacy.
Well, one thing to say about legacy is that to the extent that there is a legacy in this, and in particular in relation to the World Cup, the legacy always goes to the league, in my view, the Football League. So, for example, so any country that hosts the World Cup, the National League sees a jump in attendance in the years following. And that's... what's interesting about that, I think, is that some countries have seemed to ride that wave. Some leagues have ridden that wave better. I think probably the best example is Germany in 2006, where there was substantial investment in stadiums. A good share of that money was actually funded by the clubs themselves. They paid for it themselves. And since the event, the Bundesliga has seen a significant rise in attendance. Now, one thing you also might say about that is it fell at the right time. There was a happy set of circumstances. But I think what you'd also say is that the Germans took the view of the World Cup itself as an event, not really justifying it as an investment in the future and legacy and all that, but really as just something that Germans were going to enjoy and have fun. And actually, that was the best thing about the 2006 World Cup, to see Germans having fun and see the rest of the world having fun with Germans.
And what do you think of a place like Qatar 2022? I mean, I was out filming here this week at what will be Lusail City, a whole brand new city which will be built with 2022 in mind. Is there something to be said for hosting in a country which needs these things put in place? You know, public transport, good roads, they're lacking here. At least these will be a real tangible benefit when the World Cup is over.
I think the problem with this is that actually the cost of building such things around the Olympics usually ends up being, you know, something like double what it would cost you if you didn't have the Games or the World Cup. And of course, in Qatar's case, I mean, I think the real question is, you know, the value of building these huge stadiums, which well, if they're going to be temporary structures, it's a huge expense. So whether in global terms, whether it meets a standard of cost-benefit analysis might be questionable. But I think the fundamental point is that Qatar, as an oil-rich state with a small population, can easily afford it. So, as I say, if you think it's worthwhile spending the money on consumption, then fair enough, it's worthwhile doing that.
Stefan Zemansky from the Michigan Center for Sport Management. Great to get your views. Thank you very much indeed. And that is our show for this week, but there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/business. The latest business headlines are there, plus all of our previous episodes for you to catch up on. And then to get in touch, you can tweet me at Kamal AJE, our business editor at Abid Oliver Ali, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is the address. But that is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.